Welcome everyone to another edition of Encore Learning Presents. Today we have two Virginia leaders who will discuss and chat between the two of them to recount some of their experiences and also provide some perspective on opportunities for women today and in the future. Over to Chris McLaughlin.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
Today, we are happy to have two distinguished leaders from Virginia talking to us in a conversation format that I think you'll enjoy. Claire Guthrie Gastañaga has 40 years of government relations, political, and legal experience at local, state, and federal levels. She has actually argued cases in the Supreme Court of the United States as well as in the Supreme Court of Virginia. She recently completed 9 years as the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Virginia. Now she is ChangeServant and is a highly rated speaker on a variety of topics, including effective advocacy, legislative process, nonprofit governance, voting and civil rights, police and criminal legal reform, and women's issues. Our second speaker, or other speaker, I should say, is the Honorable Viola Baskerville, who served in the Virginia House of Delegates and as Secretary of Administration in the cabinet of Virginia Governor Tim Kaine. In that capacity, she was responsible for overseeing several state government agencies, including the Virginia State Board of Elections, the Department of General Services, the Department of Human Resources Management, and the Department of Minority Business Enterprise. Prior to that, she served on the Richmond, Virginia City Council. Currently, she serves as a trustee on the Virginia Outdoors Foundation and is an avid genealogist. I think we'll all learn something today, which is what Encore Learning is all about. So with that, Viola and Claire, it's all yours.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, it is going to be fun. Viola and I've been thinking of this in as a fireside chat between the two of us, and we wanted to look at it from the women's history perspective. We wanted to have a conversation about our lived history and what we might have learned and what we might say about what the future might hold. And so we thought we'd start by doing a little bit of a chronology of our lives beyond our resumes, if you will. And then we have a series of kind of discussion questions that we're going to ask each other. And then you're going to have an opportunity to ask us questions. So you put those in the Q&A down at the bottom of the page. And then we'll do your questions at the end after we've exhausted our ability to amuse each other. So Viola, do you want to start?
To reminisce.
Yeah, to reminisce. Do you want to start and talk a little bit about your own chronology?
Sure. A lot of people may be aware of my public life, but before the public life, there was a private life. I was born in 1951, and I grew up in the city of Richmond, segregated city of Richmond, in a segregated community. My mother was a nurse's aide and my father was a carpenter. So they were very working class individuals. Went to Richmond public schools, segregated schools again. Actually had an opportunity in 8th grade to explore the education environment of a girls' private school in Massachusetts, New England, small town with a lot of wealthy girls and a lot of girls that were from various backgrounds. And it really was a cultural shift, almost a shock in a way. After high school, I applied to the College of William and Mary, again, going back to a cultural shock. The Old South, in 1969, when I entered William and Mary, Governor Linwood Holton had just come into office, and he was a very progressive leader. He was a Republican governor, but he believed that Virginia had to dismantle its institutions of higher learning. It had to desegregate them. So he was very aggressive in that way. Y.B. Pascal, I remember, was the president of College of William and Mary, and old Mr. Pascal wasn't too happy about that, but a year or so after Governor Holton came in, Mr. Pascal retired. And I would like to think that was because of a come to Jesus moment that Governor Holton had with Y.B. Pascal. And it's interesting that later on, Tim Kaine would be his son-in-law, and that I would serve in Governor Kaine's administration. Had some wonderful opportunities at William and Mary, although a month into being a student there, I was ready to leave. But I stuck in there. You know, the saying is, you know, you can't quit, you know, you just have to keep going sometimes. I had a wonderful professor there, a woman professor who was one of my German professors, and she encouraged me to apply for a Fulbright scholarship. So I did, and I won a scholarship to study at the University in Bonn in Germany and stayed there for a year. Going there again was another cultural shock. It seems like I've been ping-pong back and forth through these cultural shocks, back and forth. But it really opened my eyes as far as the world was concerned. It wasn't just a black and white world. There were grays and there were cultures in between. There were languages in between. There were people coming from different walks of life in between. So it really broadened my perspective as far as the human race and as far as people are concerned. Came back, got married. So to my college sweetheart, although he wasn't in college at the time, he was in medical school. And we ended up having 2 kids. But before the second kid was born, the first kid was born, and I was in law school with an 8-month-old baby boy and trying to do law school, trying to do the wife bit, trying to do the mother thing. It was just trying to balance all these balls at one time. There were about 25% of my class that were women, but I noticed that of the women, the Black women were the ones that had a larger proportion of Black women who had children. So we became each other's support systems, understanding what we were going through. Finished law school, and we were moving from one state to the other, clear across country from Iowa to California. And my husband was starting his practice, and then came baby number 2. He eventually finished out his fellowships, and we moved back to Virginia. So a lot of traveling in between, and settled down. And kind of after my kids were older, I looked around and said, what am I going to do with this education? What am I going to do with law school? I was really not going to pursue a political career. I had no idea whatsoever that I was going to do that. However, a neighbor left petitions on my doorstep, and she said, we're looking for somebody to run for city council. And I said, good, who are you looking for? Can I help them? Can I help them sign their petitions? No, we're talking about you. You are going to run. So very encouraged to run. I did. I said, well, you know, if I don't run, they're going to keep hounding me. So I didn't want them to keep hounding me. So I ran. And then by golly, I beat a 12-year incumbent who had been former mayor of the city, and then went into the House of Delegates. And of course, from the House of Delegates to Senator Kaine's administration, still trying to balance all of these things, house, husband, kids, who had become by that time young men, and retired from government after the Kaine administration. And then was quiet and behaving myself until Claire called me and said, we need you to just temporarily head up our Girl Scout council. Just a little bit, just 1 year, which ended up being 3 years. But I really loved it. Executive experience at a nonprofit was a good switch from government. And finally, 2 years in, I said, Claire, I said 1 year, it's been 2 years, you got to find somebody. The board has to find somebody. They found somebody and I retired and chilled out a bit, and then had the opportunity now to get into something I really, really love, which is, you know, genealogy. But Governor Northam called me back to service, and I am now finishing out the second term of my stayed on the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, which is it's really interesting how life sort of has all these twists and turns, but it's been an interesting space.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'm going to tell my story, and what you'll see is that Viola's a little younger than I am, so I was a little ahead of her, but we intersect several times.
I'm hiding the gray, Claire.
I know. Well, I gave up. We intersect several times in our life stories. My dad was in the military for 39 years, and my earliest recollections are when we were stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Harry Truman wrote the desegregation order for the military. And so I lived on an Army base where I went to kindergarten with Black children. And I remember, very early memory of mine was being in love with a little guy in kindergarten whose name was Ofer Cephas Jr. And he came to school every day in his white shirt and his bow tie and either his long pants or his shorts, depending on the season. And I thought he was the bestest thing in the world. And then, of course, we moved to Northern Virginia in Fairfax County. And this was after Brown versus Board of Education, but Fairfax County, most people don't think of this. And part of what Viola and I are trying to illustrate today is, a lot of the conversations going on today talk about our history as if it's some deep, dark thing that happened in the past, whether it was our racial history or history vis-a-vis the discrimination against women. And what we're trying to illustrate is we're still here. This was our life experience. And Fairfax County didn't begin desegregating after Brown versus Board of Education until 1960. And just as they announced that they were finally going to begin to come into compliance with Brown versus Board, 6 years after the Supreme Court decided the case 9 miles away, we were on our way to Hawaii. And people would say to me, "Oh, that's so exciting. You're going to a racial paradise." And I thought, what does that mean? And what I ultimately discovered was it meant people assumed I was going to be living on an Army base and that I would be living with and potentially going to school with Black children. They saw it as this whole sort of idea of black and white. And of course, we arrived in 1961, which was 3 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. And I was a rising 7th grader, and I pick up the Honolulu Advertiser, and it still said help wanted men and help wanted women, but it also said AJA only, American Japanese ancestry only need apply, Chinese only need apply. And it became clear to me that, as Viola was said, a lot of this history is much more complicated, obviously, than black and white. I'm old enough that I wasn't allowed to go to UVA because our system of higher education in Virginia was both racially segregated and gender segregated when I was in high school. And the first class of undergraduate women who graduated from UVA graduated the same year I graduated from law school. My law school class was 8% women, and I remember the first day I arrived on the grounds, as they say at the University of Virginia. I walked up the steps of the law school, and there were all these guys who, many of them were returning Vietnam veterans. They were grown-ups. They were not children. They were not recent college graduates, sitting out on the front steps, literally holding up rating cards for the women law students who were going in the building. And just as you sort of had that sort of, oh my God moment at William and Mary about what have I done? I was like, holy moly, what have I gotten myself into? I mean, I remembered when I went to college, some boys did that, in the cafeteria my freshman year in college, but to be entering law school and facing that same kind of, behavior was a little daunting at first. But remember, I mean, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which gave women the ability to have our own credit cards and take loans out in our own name, didn't pass till after I graduated from law school. My dad had to co-sign my first, loan for a car, even though I had a full-time job. And irony of ironies, you mentioned Linwood Holton beginning to work hard, not just to walk his own child into the into
Absolutely.
the local elementary school that was predominantly Black, but also to make sure that the higher education system
Absolutely.
desegregated. And I walked into the Department of Health, Education and Welfare Office for Civil Rights, and the two cases they handed me on my first day were the Virginia and North Carolina higher desegregation cases that had been filed in 1968. So I can't say that Holton was completely voluntary in his addressing this issue, because there were these Title VI cases that were out there. But those cases were filed in 1968, 69. When I joined the Virginia Attorney General's office in 1986, after having left the federal government and gone to Princeton as in-house counsel and gone to the American Council on Education and gone to a big Washington law firm, I got to the AG's office in 1986, and the Virginia higher education desegregation case was still pending.
Amazing.
Right?
Amazing.
68 to 86, and it didn't get resolved. There wasn't a settlement agreement until 2001 or a little after. Happened during Gilmore's administration. So, you know, we think about these things and recognize that the process of desegregating higher education began with Sweat versus Painter and some cases that were in the 40s that had to do with law schools and graduate schools in Texas and Missouri, and then through a Florida case, Florida ex rel. Hawkins, which happened about the same time as Brown. But there was a whole move to desegregate higher education before elementary and secondary education, and yet in the southern states, you know, we're talking in
Decades.
the 2000s before there was a consent agreement. That doesn't mean that they achieved everything they, you know, wanted. But so, you know, I mean, when I went to Princeton as assistant legal counsel in 1976, I was the most senior woman in the administration at the time. That didn't last too long, but there was a woman dean of the college not too long after that. I did have the privilege of being the interim president at Chatham College, now university, at age 33, and I became the first woman chief deputy attorney general at age 44. And I'll just say one word about that. I did not become chief deputy attorney general in Virginia because a woman who was attorney general appointed me. In fact, the woman who was attorney general looked me in the eye when she resigned to run for governor and said, you should be chief deputy and you should be the person who would be the interim AG while I'm gone, but I can't appoint you because you're a woman. I have a chief of staff who's a woman, and I can't have an all-woman team. And so the person who made me the first chief deputy attorney general of Virginia who was a woman was a guy named Steve Rosenthal. So, but, you know, you see these kind of, you know, intersections in our lives where you were experiencing our segregated systems in a particular way as you were coming up in elementary and secondary school and beyond, and I was experiencing them, you know, obviously quite differently, but we were sort of in the same place at the same time, almost, on some things. So can we go from that to talk about a time when you experienced being a first or an only one in a place and time? I mean, and how did you respond and what did you learn?
I would say, of course, at first, as I took it, probably not, there were others before me, but certainly the first in my generation to go on from college to actually from high school to college. My mother did graduate from high school. So that was important. She was always a big pusher of education. So I would say that was a first in my family, but being a first in a environment that was not predominantly Black would have been high school in East Northville, Massachusetts, and certainly the College of William and Mary. Particularly with respect to my major, when I was probably the only one, I was the only one in the classroom. In fact, I remember my senior year, I was taking a 400 level course, and there were only 2 students, the professor, myself, and the white student. We had to show up each day, both of us. And so there was a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure to perform. There was a lot of pressure to, quote, uphold the race, more so than uphold the gender. It was uphold the race, because if you backed out, if you didn't do what you were supposed to do, that said more about, see, I told you we shouldn't have admitted them because they can't hold up, they can't do the work. So I would say at William and Mary was the spotlight really on me.
What was the percentage of undergraduates at that time who were students of color? Do you remember?
Well, I do know that my class entered the fall of '69, and there were 6 of us, so a total of 6, but the undergrad population was about 3,800, so roughly 1,000. So you're talking about 6 out of 1,000.
Oh,
and we used to have this joke among ourselves, because if you've ever been on the campus of William and Mary, you know, there's the sunken gardens. And so you could see from the north end to the south end, east to west end. So if we stood at one end and saw the other African-American student way down the other end, we could tell who they were by phenotype. I mean, skin color, height, everything. We could just yell and say, hey, how you doing? But that was undergrad, but there were African-American students in law school, but we really didn't mingle that much at the time. But so, you know, 6 out of about 1,000 per class.
Wow. Yeah, when I went to UVA, there were no faculty of color at the law school, and there was one woman. What did the faculty look like at Wayne?
Well, we had to bar. We had to bar faculty. When I say bar, there were people on leave from Hampton who came, or Virginia State, who came and taught a semester at William and Mary. But the faculty was mostly white, and it was mostly male. And you know, we as Black students we had to get together and say, listen, this is the professor you definitely do not want to take a course from, because he fails students of color just out of GP, general principle. And so it's almost protect, you know, a sense of camaraderie to protect each other. But some professors were, you know, they didn't get the memo. They didn't get the desegregation memo. And so they were not going to abide.
They were not happy, right? Oh, goodness. Well, you know, I mean, it's interesting when I think back of, you know, there were several times in my career where I was the only woman in the room. And one of my favorite stories is about a time when I was at the American Council on Education, and we were talking about this particular legal question, and the then president of Georgetown University, Father Tim Healy, you know, got his dander up and shouted, well, if, you know, somebody had referred to the president of Princeton having had a lawyer who said something about this issue. And Father Healy shouted at the top of his lungs, well, if Bill Bowen had a lawyer, let's get him in here. I'm like, that would be me. and I, you know, and then we were in this meeting, and it was just me and all these guys, and I had a sign in front of me that had my name and my title, assistant, you know, legal counsel. And Father Healy came up to me afterward, kind of, you know, like still upset, and he said, well, counselor, you ought to wear a sign. And I looked at him and I said, you know, Father Healy, I thought the 3-piece navy blue suit with the button-down shirt
was
and the tie was
giveaway.
as close to the collar as we lawyers could possibly get. And he laughed. But you know, you always had to deal with kind of the assumptions, presumptions about, you know, and particularly as you and I would have both been young then, the actual additional discount of being perceived as too young to know anything.
Well, one of the presumptions that African-American students had to deal with at the time, because of the push of affirmative action, was that you got into this institution because of affirmative action. And I said, well, you know, affirmative action may have gotten me through the door, but I had to prove myself to stay in the room. And, you know, to this day, of those 6 students that entered, those 6 African-American students that entered with me into William and Mary College of, in the fall of 1969, we had 100% graduation rate.
Good for you.
I don't think you could say that among the white students that were there. So we had to stay in the room. We had to fight to stay in the room.
You had to fight to stay in the room. So was there a game changer at some point down the road in your career that you would point to that made a huge difference?
I think the realization of trying to juggle too many balls at one time was the eye opener. My parents never told us that we couldn't do or be anything that we wanted to be or do. I think where there was a miscommunication or I didn't get the memo was where, hey, Chicka, you can't do them all at one time. I think trying to just juggle being a student, being a spouse, being a parent. I think law school, that's where I hit the wall and I had to realize that I had to let some things go or either adjust my schedule. So instead of taking 15 hours, I went to the dean and said, hey, can I take 12 and still be a full-time student and still maintain my scholarship? And he said, sure, we can make that happen. Of course, I had to get more babysitters. I mean, I actually had to take Tim, who's my son, who was a baby at the time, to classes with me. And then thank God I had a professor who understood and he didn't mind having kids in his classroom while he was trying to lecture on constitutional law. Of course, at times he had to raise his voice because Tim, my beloved son, was very talkative. He's still very vocal. But I think just trying to balance all of those things, because this was the 70s, and there was still a high expectation that the woman carries the burden, I mean, of child raising, even if you're a student. I think maybe those duties are probably understood or negotiated better between, partners and spouses now, but then, it's understanding.
I don't know. Because I'm the oldest of 6 kids, I tease and say sometimes I was like not a sous chef, but a sous mom. And so I feel like that taught me a lot about kind of the burdens that you're talking about. So I sort of had an intuitive sense I didn't want to take them on my own. But the guy I dated in law school and I used to have this conversation about whether I wanted children or not. And I would say, well, I want children. I just want to be the dad. I don't want to be the person that the school nurse calls, right? And he would say, well, that means you don't want children. I said, no, I just want the quality time part.
Absolutely.
And he would say, well, we'll share responsibilities. And I said, yeah, that word share, that's about, it's my job and you're going to be nice to me. So I well understand what you're saying about the expectations, because Lord knows, I mean, that would have been the expectation.
Well, speak about that dad piece. Why? I mean, I got to meet your dad.
Yeah.
The general,
yeah.
who was just a fabulous person. I really love him. But and the roles that dads play in our lives.
Right. Yeah, my dad was a little bit sometimes hard to figure because, he came up, his dad died in 1929, and he was like 8 or 9 years old in the middle of the Depression. And his mother, my grandmother Claire, had an insurance company, and she kept body and soul together. I mean, her dad arranged for her to get an appointment as on the tax assessment board, which my dad told me paid $100 a month and really saw them through the Depression. But my father was the middle of 3 kids. He had an older sister and a younger sister, and a mom. And so he grew up in a woman-centered household. And yet he went off to all boys prep school and all men's college. He went to Princeton, not available to me when I graduated from high school because it was still gender segregated back then. But I always felt like he liked women more than men. And that despite the fact that he was in the Army for 39 years and retired as a 4-star general, he had this soft spot in his heart for women, so soft that he was opposed to women in combat because I don't think he wanted to see their parts on the battlefield. But he was an interesting guy. He gave a speech in 1977 about inclusivity in the military and in the civilian service that I could give today, and people would think I was forward looking. And yet by the time he, was in later in life, and after my mother passed away and he was living alone, he spent a little too much time with Fox. And I once had to say to him, would the alien who'd taken over my dad's body please leave and give me my father back? Because the guy that I had known all my life to be really committed, I mean, from Fort Sill, Oklahoma, when he spoke out against segregated army units, through this time when he was commanding different commands and incorporating achievement of affirmative action objectives in his officer efficiency reports and all those things, all of a sudden he was asking me questions and I'm like, yeah, what planet? So I told Javier that my husband that, there's a thing that happens with the psychology of aging where you get increasingly focused on your own personal physical and financial security to the exclusion of everything else. And that if that happened, the backyard was a really good place to put me down. But so when you think about women whose shoulders you stand, I certainly stand on my grandmother Claire's shoulder and my grandmother's and great grandmother on my mother's side. When you think about, through your research and genealogy and otherwise, who are the women that you look back to as a part of our Virginia history that you would say you
well, I'm going to start at home, of course.
by?
It's my mother. I mean, she's finished high school in 1939. She was the youngest of 13 kids. And she actually was one that had an opportunity to get an education. She spent about 2 months in undergrad, but when the tuition of $56 a semester couldn't be afforded, she had to stop. But she pushed all her daughters and all her children to go as far as they could in school. So I'd have to say my mother. I think in the political realm, it would have to have been the great late Senator Yvonne Miller, who was just a champion for people's rights, for human rights, for very much supportive of me the whole time I was in the General Assembly. So just a great role model. So I have to say those two were my role models. I think about women that I, have the ability to lean on now. Is my law school classmate, and of course, Claire, you and I have chats all the time. We have really deep chats, which are beneficial. It's to continue to understand each other. And I think the first white female that I probably would have to give props to was a senior. She was a senior at Mount Holyoke College. The summer I was in the ABC program, a Better Chance program, as a 13-year-old. And she really complimented me on my art. And I knew I wasn't an artist, but she just made me feel real good about what I could do if I just kept trying. So I'd have to say those individuals.
It's I think tell folks a little bit about the genealogy research you've been doing and how that's unfolded for you. I mean, if I were to search back my history, my grandmother Claire was a daughter of American Revolution. Her people, my father's family, the Guthries, left Scotland because they were Presbyterians. And they weren't Church of England or Catholic, so they were being persecuted. So they went to Ireland, and then they left Ireland for the same reasons. And so they were in Western Pennsylvania before the Revolutionary War. And and for me, if I were really to be as deep into genealogy as you are, it would be fairly easy for me to trace back. Tell us a little bit about how that's different for you in terms of finding your own life history.
Well, in some ways, you start at the same point you would with, your family. You go back as far as you can with paper documentation, and then you hit brick walls where people didn't want to give you information, or there were secrets. For instance, on my father's side, there are about 4 different lines that are European lines. 2 are French Huguenots, and 1 is English, and another one is Irish. And found a 5th one, which makes sense, that was Ashkenazi Jewish. And it was actually my bio great-grandfather. And people just did not talk about the rape of Black women. They just did not talk about relationships between the enslaver and enslaved people. And so you go back as far as you can with documents, and then you start with the genetics, and you start with the DNA, and you learn about how DNA can help you put together your family. So because lines on my father's side were documented, well documented with respect to the European lines, there's one line that goes back to 1555, which is well documented. But on my mother's side, I'd been really struggling with her paternal line, had documented it back to an enslaved person, a enslaved man in 1780 in King William County. And I thought I'd just take a break. And then I met up with an individual who is a direct descendant of Carter Braxton, the Virginia signer of the Declaration of Independence, about 10 months ago. And we were looking at the Braxton line because that's my mother's maiden name. That was my mother's maiden name. And we were trying to figure out if we were related. And we did genetic testing, and we found out we were half cousins. And our most recent common ancestor was 7 generations ago, which would have put it at her 6th great grandfather or 5th great grandfather was actually my 6th great grandfather, who was actually a member of the Governor's Council. His name was Henry Richard Corbin, or Richard Henry Corbin, out of Middlesex, Virginia. So, we are finding that we do the documentation, follow the documentation that leads as far as we can go. Then we do DNA testing, and then DNA testing often leads us to more documentation, and it's a cycle. But it uncovers the dark underbelly of American history, which is the whole impact of slavery and the rape of Black women, which is a painful story. But the genetic connections help me to understand and go back further in time. So it's good when you have descendants who are willing to go on that journey with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about what William and Mary has done to recognize the role of enslaved people at the college. I know you were involved in some of that.
Well, they certainly have their acknowledgement statements where they post continuously, and they review and read at every event. About 5 years ago, I think it was now, they recognized the first African-American women who were in the dorms. They have a tremendous wealth of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our governor has taken the word equity out of a lot of what he does now. But I think they go full steam with recognizing the diverse demographic groups that have made William and Mary what it is today. They've gone through a revolution over the last 50 to 55 years. Of course, their president, Kathleen Rowe, first female president of the institution, is very committed to learning and truth-telling. And the board has come a long way and is committed to learning and truth-telling. Recently, last year, I think it was, you see a lot of dorms being renamed, and they do have a memorial to the enslaved laborers at the College of William and Mary, which is important, as well as uplifting and marking sites that pertain to the African-American community.
So looking at that and looking at the progress that William and Mary's made, and UVA has done some similar things, I read today that Florida has banned, that some parent got upset about folks in her elementary school showing their kids a little film that Disney did on Ruby Bridges, who's the little girl who is in the picture of, all the
Norman Rockwell.
And was the little girl in the doorway when the governor of Arkansas was trying to stand away, in front of her being able to go to school. But what's going to happen? Where are we now? Are we at an inflection point of some kind?
Absolutely. We're in a battle for the truth. And I
Mhm.
think all of us that respect knowledge, respect learning, you're talking about banning books, that's just the equivalent of burning books in the Nazi period. You know, knowledge is power, and we can see that there are entities, political entities, that have really stirred the fire to keep people oppressed by keeping them ignorant. You know, you can control people if you can keep them uninformed, unlearned. And that seems to be the direction in which political leaders want to go. Some political leaders want to go, I must say it.
I don't know,
And it's
read,
dangerous. It's very dangerous because they talk about protecting the children. Well, what happens when a child grows up to be 50, 55 years old, is shielded from the truth, and then realizes that the persons who were supposed to help them the most, the adult figures in their lives, whether it's teachers, parents, whatever, had lied to them? What happens then?
Yeah.
And then we become, we continue to, you know, fight against each other instead of moving forward as a human race.
Yeah, there's I wonder, there are about 500,000 Puerto Ricans living in the greater Orlando, Tampa area, Florida, part of Florida. And when Florida went after Roberto Clemente's bio, I thought, you're asking for serious trouble, because, you know, Roberto Clemente is a revered figure in Puerto Rico, and the idea that you couldn't have children read his biography because he was a Black Puerto Rican, and what we can't elevate anybody who doesn't look like us to somebody that we should study and learn from. I mean, it's unfathomable to me, frankly, to understand some of this that's going on. For me, I mean, I woke up the morning after the draft of what became the Supreme Court decision in the abortion case came out, and I don't have it on today, but I have a 1972 bracelet I got that says ERA on it, and it was something that the League of Women Voters sold back then, and I have it, and it's, you know, it's from 1972, and when we were trying to pass the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and I put it on that morning because I knew exactly where it was, because I felt like somebody had taken, you know, somebody had rewound the VCR of my life and my career, because my very first legislative experience while I was a law student, so I think it was either the winter of 72 or the winter of 73, I was standing before the House Privileges and Elections Committee, chaired by Jim Thompson from Alexandria. And one of the ranking Republicans was Eva Marie Scott, who was the first woman, you know, she was a Republican woman elected from down Fluvanna, you know, somewhere in that area of the state. And she ultimately went on to become a senator. And she was sitting there, and she had invited Phyllis Schlafly to come and testify against the Equal Rights Amendment. And so I'm up there as this little law student explaining why the Equal Rights Amendment was a good thing and why we should support it. And Eva Marie Scott, who never said the word Mrs. in her whole life because she was Southern, she would say Ms., right, was terrified that if she said Ms., people would think she was saying MS period. So she kept referring to Phyllis Schlafly as Ms. Schlafly. and I would sit there and think, oh my God. And of course, Schlafly's whole testimony was, we don't want women in combat. We're worried about going to the bathroom with men, you know, all these classic, you know, Equal Rights Amendment type shibboleths. But what people have forgotten, and this is sometimes, it's so important to bring kind of things back to light. When the Constitution was revised in 1970 and approved by the voters in 1971, Virginia's Constitution has an Equal Rights Amendment in it. I mean, it has a constitutional prohibition against sex discrimination, with a little carve out to preserve VMI's right to stay all boys, subsequently by the wayside under a federal court decision. But we do have a prohibition against sex discrimination explicitly in the Virginia Constitution. And strangely enough, when I was arguing before the P&E committee in favor of the constitutional amendment, ratifying the federal constitutional amendment, people kept saying, well, we don't need that because we have that in Virginia. And the irony of that is that subsequently the Virginia Supreme Court keeps saying that we should interpret our Virginia Constitution the same as the federal Constitution, because essentially the same people wrote both, except the same people did not write the 1970 Constitution. And so it needs to be given some meaning legally. And it's one of my goals in terms of future work, to find a way to see if we can't put a case in front of the Virginia Supreme Court that makes them acknowledge that we actually have an Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution that should protect us in Virginia, even if the federal Constitution doesn't protect us. So that's, if I were to list one of the things that still needs to be done, that's one's high on my priority list. How about you? What would you say we still need to try to do? What's on your agenda?
I think on a very basic level, it's something that I've tried to do, is pass the baton. I think we need to encourage the next generation of leaders. I think we need to mentor younger women. I think we need to make sure we support younger women, whether it's, you know, dollars and cents if they're running into in a political race, especially the women that have the orientation that they're going to speak up for other women and families and children. I think we need to also make sure that we have growing room for them, whether that's to be appointed to boards or commissions, so that they have a seat at the table, so they're learning from us. I think we also need to make sure there is support in the way of you know, what you know, Claire and I do. I mean, if there's a mentor-mentee special relationship you can find with one on an individual level to do that. And just to be aware, I mean, it's interesting, you were talking about, you know, rights, you know, white men had the right to vote first, then Black men, then white women, but Black women were last as far as guaranteeing the right to vote. But yet still, when we look at the progress that we've made legislatively, whether it's progressive legislation or whether it's representation, it's been on the backs of Black women. And so I think we need to think in general about balancing and having support for all women, and not necessarily women feeling they have to play with the boys. I think playing on the boys' team is a dangerous thing, and I see it happening with somebody like Nikki Haley right now. I mean, just very dangerous, because that does not help to bring about equity and justice and balance and opportunities for the next generation of really strong women leaders that bring everybody to the table.
Yeah, playing on the women's team, Gail Evans has a really wonderful book about that. And I wrote something a long time ago about applying that in the political context, because I think it was when, you know, you and I were both around the edges of Make Women Count, which was a PAC that we started to try to do exactly what you're talking about in Virginia, to support women who shared our values regardless of party. And we couldn't keep it going because we couldn't get women to understand how important it was to support other women. And it was kind of astounding to me. I mean, similarly, we tried in Virginia to start a Virginia Women's Foundation, and the same year we tried to start it in Virginia, Vermont started theirs. Vermont had $2 million in their endowment, and within 18 months to 2 years max, we never could get it off the ground. We couldn't get people to support it.
In a state named after a woman.
And in a state named after a woman. And it was like, you know, it's hard to fully understand and appreciate what the on the ground issues were there. Partly, I think it was Virginia's philanthropic community at the time, frankly, was relatively underdeveloped for the 11th largest state. And you compared in Virginia, I mean, California had 3 women's foundations. Almost every other state had at least one women's foundation that was committed to funding women and girls at a time when about 4% of the philanthropic dollars were going to women and girls. And yet we couldn't get any traction. And I mean, we tried for about 8 years and then just abandoned ship and said, this isn't going to happen. I'd love to see if there was any more likelihood we could get it to go today, but it's so, I mean, I look and I think, okay, what things have changed, what haven't, and is there progress we're in danger of losing? I gotta say, I'm pretty fearful about the potential for loss more than I am optimistic about, the ground we've gained. Where's your head on all that?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, because we see in the political arena where things are going, with women's rights, with, when Rose was decided, I automatically went back to 1972, 1973, my senior year in undergrad, where we had, when I said we, there was a small group of Black students that rallied around a young woman that was a minister's kid, had gotten pregnant, and there was no way that she was going to be able to address that issue. We gathered money to get her on a bus to New York, and one of us volunteered to take her to New York and be with her. But I said, oh my gosh, we're going to go back to this area of, risky back alley abortions. And my mind went back to that. But now with the number and amount of young people that are protesting, that are using social media to push a movement forward, it's been a little quiet. It was really noisy after the mass shootings that they had in school. But I think if the young leaders continue to use their network, continue to speak out, I think they're going to see things that are impacting them, really hard, and they're going to be out there taking leadership roles and securing our future. I have hope in the young people. It's just a very troubled time right now that we're going through.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I appreciate when people say that they're basing their hope on their perception of the next generation, but it's young people that in Japan installed somebody who's taking women backwards. I was in Charlottesville in August of, and most of the people marching in the street wearing brown shirts and carrying tiki torches were young men. And if you look at the 2006 crowds, and I mean, I got to say, there seems to be energy on both sides in the next generation.
We got to keep up the energy on the younger people that are about having a more just, more humane society.
Yep, I agree. And I mean, I have to say the most encouraging political sign I could point to recently is Jennifer McClellan's recent election as the first African-American woman congressperson from Virginia. What was encouraging about it was that 26,000 people turned out on the Saturday after Christmas in a firehouse primary in bad weather to vote.
Yeah.
And she energized those people to show up. And similarly, when they did the general election for the 4th congressional, it was a special election, but the general as opposed to primary, she beat her opponent like by 20 to 30 points more than Donald McEachin had beat his opponent in the election that transpired last November. So it gives me some hope that you're right, that presented with somebody who's for something and
the right candidate
and the right person who can articulate a positive vision, that people will be energized to engage. And she certainly engaged younger voters.
Absolutely. But, we have to have women that reach back. I mean, when I gave up my seat to run for lieutenant governor, I mean, Jennifer was right there. And I said, Jennifer, this seat will be open, the House of Delegates. It's yours to run for. Don't think too long, because some other people are thinking too. If I were you, I'd jump in here and do that. But that's passing the baton. There are often women leaders who get in a position who become comfortable and do not think about their legacy or passing the baton on to the next generation. And I think we have to be careful when we do that.
they
And
don't do the
support them when they're there.
right. They don't do the succession planning. That's so important to ensure the future voices are similar. Do you want to, can you talk a little bit? Are you willing to talk a little bit about the 2005 race? I mean,
You mean when I got on the phone and I asked people for money, and black and white, and who had given to all these other delegates, but either they didn't return my call after I called them 20 times, or left some bogus reason for not supporting me. Yeah, it was very hurtful, because the reason I ran was for the people. It was not for me, because I had to give up a seat to run. But when people say they're going to support you and don't, and you wonder, then why am I running if you don't even get the financial support? And of course, at that time, it was very hard to raise money. It's very hard traditionally for Black female candidates to run to raise money. But we ended up, I think, raising the least amount of money, but we didn't come in last. So that was encouraging.
I mean, this is the 2005 lieutenant governor's race, and if you went back and looked at a map of the votes that were cast in that primary, it was a four-way primary. Leslie Byrne from Northern Virginia, Chap Peterson from Northern Virginia, Phil Puckett from Southwest, and Viola. And if you look at a map of the way the votes were cast in that primary, Phil Puckett's votes were all way down in the, in the fighting ninth. He didn't have any intensity,
statewide,
no intensity beyond that. Chap Peterson had a very small pocket of intensity up in Northern Virginia, and very little, downstate. Leslie, partly because she got asked me to do 250,000 phone calls for her, she had a little bit of representation both in Northern Virginia and a bit in Tidewater. But when you looked at your profile of your electorate, it was the widest swath. It went from the border in North Carolina through Southside, up through Richmond, into the northern neck, and sort of the whole central Virginia, and then a little bit out this way, and a little bit, but you had the strongest voter profile of the distribution of your voters of any of the four candidates. We just couldn't quite get you enough of them.
I know. But if you talk to people about their issues, I think at that time, certainly this was after, Governor Wilder ran and won. But if you talk to people about the issues where they are, what's important to them, that's what they want to hear more than anything else. And if you do that, then you'll have the ability to kind of win over their support.
So when you think about having, certainly the first Black woman in modern history to run statewide, what lesson would you say that you wanted to pass on to the next person who runs statewide, who shares your values?
To be yourself, to be authentic, to learn and understand the people that you aspire to represent. To listen, that's very important. Leaders have to listen because and do less talking, because you want to represent them. They want to have the ability to hear you, to feel that you understand them, and to network wider, so that you can reach those deep pockets where that money is. Get out of your comfort zone.
Yeah. I got it. I mean, I think authenticity is key. I used to work with Dick Cranwell, who was from Vinton, which is down near Roanoke. And Dick was elected consistently from a district that literally voted 60% for Ollie North against Chuck Robb, right? It wasn't exactly what you call a liberal district. And Dick was, pro-choice, and he was, he wasn't exactly where I would have liked him to be on guns, but that's Southwest Virginia.
That's the area, yeah.
But on every other issue that counted, he used to say, "I wear an ale on my head," proudly. And I went down to the McDonald's with him on Thursday morning. He'd go down and have coffee with a bunch of the good old boys who had coffee there every Thursday morning. And I'd say to them, well, why do you support Dick? I mean, he isn't with you on a lot of stuff that I would think you would care about. He's, he's liberal, and a lot of things he's, and they look at him and they'd say, yeah, well, you always know exactly where he stands.
Yes.
You know, you're never ignorant of where he stands. And he may be a sumbitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Son of a bitch.
And I thought, you know, there's no more telling lesson for candidates to hear, because it really is, as you learned and we're describing, it's about authenticity and taking voters and saying, look, we're not going to agree on everything, but you know,
I think that's the trust.
mhm.
They trusted Dick. They knew where he was coming from. And that is important for voters to be able to trust the person that they're electing.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we have 2 questions from our audience, so I'm going to read them and then we can talk about them. Thank you for your service and persistence. I applaud your success in getting through glass ceilings, yet there are many women who never could break those ceilings, or who flat just got tired of trying, or who were held back not only by men, but by women who did not support more women in the upper levels. These are problems you mentioned too, and now still we're underrepresented in Congress and executive business slots. Across the board, women still are paid less, particularly women of color, and we have inefficient or unbelievably inaccessible childcare. Single moms, the majority of single parents, face incredible obstacles. Where the heck do we think we are now, and what do we need to do? That's how, you know, we can solve the world's problems here in a minute. But, you know, from my perspective, the playing on the women's team thing is a huge issue. You know, I hesitate to say it, but every table needs women at it, even tables I wouldn't want to be at. Okay. So when I talk about making sure, you know, women are at the table, I wrote an op-ed when Jerry Kilgore was Attorney General, and he appointed a chief of staff and a chief deputy, both of whom were women. And I congratulated him on starting out with women at the table. And I got all kinds of hassle about they weren't the right kind of women. Well, I'm never going to be at that table, but I, you know, I don't want to be at that table, right? But even if I don't want to be at the table, I want to be sure there are women at that table, because I think it's really important. And it is absolutely the case that sometimes women, our own internalized oppression leads us to not want to play on the women's team. So where do you think we are, and what can we do to?
I think we need to make sure we get some men in there battling too for us. I mean,
Mhm.
they have the discreet ability to deepen their voices and boom louder. They do that sometimes as aggressions against us when we're talking. They seem to raise their voices and you know, talk over us. But I think we start to really need to cultivate more and more men who understand the importance of having women at the table, who understand the importance of equity, who are behind us and fighting for us and fighting with us, just like, you know, my father did when we were small. He taught us the skills we needed to survive. And so we need those supportive male figures out there fighting alongside us, allies.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. David Tate wants to know, what are our thoughts about ageism? I will never forget the day that I went from being the ingenue to the old woman. And it was literally, I think it was when I crossed the line from 49 to 50. It was like, I was, you know, this up and coming young Turk for so much of my early career and into my middle age. And then all of a sudden I was an old person. And it wasn't just that I got an AARP solicitation, which I sent back as marked return to sender obscene material, of subsequently become a member because the discounts are too good to walk away from. But you know, ageism is a very real thing across the spectrum. So there's the part where we discount what younger people think and say because how could they know? And then at the same time, they discount what we might think or say because, well, what do we know? and I mean, we have the protection of law now up till there's no age limit on age discrimination. As long as you can do the job in the workforce, for example, it used to be that you could be mandatorily retired. but that went the way of all things. And so now once you cross the 40 threshold, you're protected by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And then there's another federal law that protects age at all levels, which basically says you can't use an age as a placeholder for something else unless you have valid statistical information to do that. So it's that the 18-year-old driver's license, for example, is perceived as being a use of age to as a placeholder for maturity. So, I mean, I do think there's a lot of ageism to go around, and I hear more and more people talking about how this person or that person's too old to be in office, or to be a person who has and wields power. And my response always to that is, look,
can they do the job?
Not about their chronology. It's about, can they do it? I mean, I think I might have come to this realization about the irrelevancy of chronology because I have a brother who's an autistic savant, and his chronological age has so little to do with anything that you need to understand about him, that I know he just turned 65. I know what his age is, but I learned very early on in interacting with him that chronology had zero to do with how I should or could evaluate what he could or couldn't do. It had nothing to do with age. And so maybe that experience. So, I mean, I'm an individualist when it comes to age. If
absolutely, can they do the job? And also realize, we have longer life expectancies, and our ability to apply life experiences to a job, in addition to our specific skills, is the value plus that I think many employers would want to have.
Yeah, I think it's always ironic when people will say to you, well, it's really important that you don't discount lived experience. But then if you're an old person and you're trying to convey your experience,
I know.
Suddenly, nobody wants to hear about that.
Yeah. What happened to my long runway experience?
Well, is there anything else we wanted to talk about that we didn't get to in terms of our conversation right now?
Hey, this is Chris. I'm going to interrupt and just remind the audience to put their questions into the Q&A. I know sometimes people want to put it in chat, but if you put it in the Q&A, our delightful panelists will answer your questions. So go back. Sorry.
Okay, I just want to talk about, how do you chill out? Claire, you have 1,000 things going on all the time. You're doing this, you're doing that. What do you do to chill? Because recharge your batteries.
Yeah, I laugh. I'm laughing because I'm spending a lot of time trying to learn how to exercise my no muscle. The one where you actually say no when people ask you, can you do this? And my husband Javier will, come in, and he did say rather poignantly the other day, so I don't think I've seen you as often since you didn't have a full-time job, because now I have 2 jobs. But I love my garden, and there's something incredibly, I don't know, restoring about fooling around in the garden, and whether I'm successful at what I'm trying to do or not successful. And I love spring, and I'm sitting here now in my 2nd floor office looking out, and there are 3 redbud trees in my backyard that we literally grew from 2-leaf seedlings, who now reach above the 2nd story of our house. And I mean, I brought the first one down from Charlottesville when a friend let me dig a bunch of daylilies from his yard because there were nothing but deer salad, and I didn't have that problem. And one of the daylily bunches had this little tiny redbud in it, and we planted it, and it's now 20 feet high, 25 feet high, and then it has 2 babies in the backyard. So spring is really my favorite, and I love going to Lewis Ginter and coming back with more daylilies and more iris from their annual plant sale, or going to Maymont's spring plant sale and coming home with more tomatoes than I can possibly plant in my raised beds. But and I have a bunch of things on my dining room table right now. hoping to become outside plants at some point.
Wonderful,
But
wonderful.
that's important. And I took myself to the ballet on Friday night because I just
Wonderful.
wanted to go, So I think that's,
Well, you
it's
used
really,
you took ballet lessons at one
I
time.
did, yeah. From the time I was like 6 to when I was 18. Yeah, I took
Wow.
ballet. So, and people say, well, did you go with anybody? No, no, sat next to a really cute young girl, 12-year-old from Charlottesville, who was there with her mother, but they couldn't get seats together, and had a really good time. So I think it's just about trying to find something that engages you, that and I am going to walk in the Monument Avenue 10K. Let's just say I'll set no records.
Good for you. Good for you.
What do you do to chill
out?
out?
Yeah, I try to get out in nature more. It's been difficult recently because we're in the middle of building a house, and so that's kind of insane right now. But and having moved 3 times in 5 years, it gets kind of crazy, and half my stuff is in storage. So, but I try to get out more now that the weather's turned, but also the pollen is out, so that's working against me.
All right, so here's the next question. It seems to me that some of our current crop of racists don't learn it at home. It's not something they grew up with. They weren't indoctrinated by their parents and grandparents. They are learning these attitudes from friends and internet sources as teens or young adults. What do you see as the lure, and how do we combat it? I will tell you that radicalization is a psychological process that is used across the spectrum of belief systems. And it has exactly the same elements, whether you're talking about radical Islamists or you're talking about the Proud Boys and the folk that I think our questioner was referring to. And it all is about focusing your energy around people who already feel somewhat alienated. And then you create other, right? You create this whole potential other enemy, other person who's less than you. You dehumanize them, and you create this sort of sense that the only way that you're going to have a family, if you will, is by joining them. I mean, and that process is the same, whether we're talking about a religious cult, a terrorist cult, or the cult of the Proud Boys. And I think I once went to a panel at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association on this issue. And they literally said there were literally thousands upon thousands of websites committed to doing this kind of work, and fewer than hundreds of websites around growing tolerance and the kinds of things that we would want to be, inculcating or in younger people. And so I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I share the concern of the questioner about the fact that that some of this indoctrination and some of this radicalization is clearly happening through that kind of process and through those kinds of organizations. I went down once when I was the head of the ACLU. I went down and did a presentation at an Oath Keepers meeting, and and it was down at a 4-H campground in the dark. I mean, it was pretty dark out there, and if you go through the Oath Keepers, the things that they swear their oath to, a lot of them were things that, I started my speech by saying, okay, I'm going to go through your oath and I'm going to tell you the things that the ACLU and you agree on. Now, I don't want to house military people in my home. I don't want my house searched without a warrant. I was sort of went through these things, and there were a couple that, about posse comitus and stuff that I wasn't completely on board with. But in that room, I was the only person in the room who wasn't packing, who didn't have a gun on them. And the people standing in the back of the room looked like they had escaped they were like characters from Duck Dynasty with their arms folded and their camo on and everything. And when the guy asked me after my speech if I wanted him to walk me to the car, I said, are you protecting me from the bears or your colleagues? But you know, I mean, I felt really strongly that I needed to go be in that place, and I used to go to tea party meetings all the time and have similar kinds of conversations. But I do worry that a whole generation of kids are being exposed to this indoctrination on the internet, and
Absolutely.
I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, what do
Absolutely.
you think?
I know it's scary. You know, not only are our kids being exposed to this type of indoctrination, but they're not having a sense of self-worth. You know, young girls are particularly vulnerable
I saw
to
that report.
social media and concepts of beauty and self-worth. You know, it's frustrating. I don't know what the correct answer is, but it is clearly as if this AI, artificial intelligence, is, you know, an ersatz, a substitute for parental involvement at a level that's positive, or positive peer pressure. It's just very frustrating.
Well, clearly the right solution to this problem is not banning books and
Absolutely not.
taking the movie about Ruby Bridges out of the library because one parent thinks it might make her child feel bad that that girl was subjected to that kind of racism. Yeah, you know, I've often said that there would come a point when people in power got a pretty clear sense that if in a demographic democracy, they weren't going to be in power anymore. And that at that point, the fight to retain power was going to get ugly. And I sort of frankly feel like that's where we are.
We are there now. It's getting ugly.
Yeah. That, you know, like power isn't ever given away. It's always taken. And
absolutely. And that's what we're balling up to. I mean, that's what we have to see.
All right. Well, I don't want to leave folk with a downer.
Negative.
So maybe we can find something positive to say. And David, I know you have some things to say as we wrap up.
Just want one question I'll throw out to you, and I don't know, this may not be the positive one you want to leave on, but it's on the political realm. It seems like the Republican Party have all of a sudden discovered that women can be good candidates and can win, but it doesn't seem like all of these successful women candidates are supportive of women issues. Of course, women can have their own political views and stand where they want to stand. But I mean, what is that how you see it, and how do you feel about what seems to be a trend in that regard?
Well, Republicans are not, you know, I mean, I don't want to be partisan, but people who are smart, doesn't matter which party, understand that women candidates can be very attractive candidates, and they can particularly be attractive if the expectation is that they're not, that you're doing something special by running that candidate. Now, here's what I know about women candidates. Regardless of how women candidates actually, regardless of what they actually believe, voters perceive women candidates as being to the left of center. And they perceive Black women candidates as being really to the left of center, regardless of who they are or the facts. And so when you are trying to maintain your conservative base, and you also recognize that there is a benefit to running a candidate who isn't a white man, is a person of color or a woman, the part of what advantages that group at that time is this, you know, the perceptions that are implicitly biased, that those candidates are not who they are. So, and Viola was talking about Nikki Haley, you know, and Winsome Sears in Virginia. All of those candidates get the benefit of being perceived, particularly by independent voters, as being maybe more middle of the road than they actually are. Yeah. And so I think it's up to us. I mean, again, I'm a firm I'm a firm advocate for women at every table. I don't care what dinner you're serving or who's present. I want women at that table. I don't want all men environments anywhere. But I also believe that those of us who, I mean, everybody has to be clear about what their value system is and do the due diligence to determine whether the person who looks like me or Viola is in fact somebody who shares your values.
Sure. Scrutinizing the candidate, doing the oppo, which is the opposition research, drilling down, are the bona fides on the curriculum vitae, are they true? So yeah, doing your homework with women candidates as you would with men candidates.
Right. Yep, absolutely. And I think, I think we can say the same thing across the board. Don't ever presume that do the research and do your due diligence and find out, whether the persons who are running for whatever office, in fact, share your values. And if go to meetings where they're present, ask them hard questions.
Don't let them get away with,
don't
not
let them get away
answering.
with dissembling, and I mean, don't let them get away with the idea that if they wear a little fleece vest that somehow they're soft and cuddly, or if they carry an assault weapon in their campaign ads, that somehow that doesn't matter. So I think you've got to really dig deep and get informed and make your own considered judgment about whether the candidate's somebody you can support, whether they're a woman or a man or a person of color or a white person.
No, that's great. Yeah, and maybe if each of you want to talk about what your dreams are for the near and long term future, maybe take us out on a high note.
Okay, Viola, you get to go first.
My dreams for the future, my God, that's a wide one. I guess my dream, since we're talking about race and gender, is that white women would step up to the table and step up to the plate and advocate more and more for values across humanity rather than thinking purse first. Think people first, not purse first. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. I mean, I still have this, I'm the girl who has always been optimistic, and I still hope that, and I'm also, unfortunately, the person who thinks that facts matter. And so I'm holding on to this idea that if we just tell the truth and put the facts out there, that people will come to our point of view about things that are, and I've discovered, almost daily that there are so many times when facts don't. I mean, one guy once told me in the middle of a conversation we were having about immigrants' rights that my facts weren't worth the toilet paper they were written on. And I was like, okay, then. But I'm a person who believes in the record. I believe in facts. I believe in truth telling, and so I think I'm going to cling to the idea that if we just all do our work and tell people the truth, that ultimately that truth will out.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. And facts matter, and think people first. And I want to thank you so much for allowing us all to be kind of a fly on the wall to this very insightful conversation between the two of you. And I think
I have to say, yes, I agree. Since Claire and I put this together with her help, we got Viola. Applause, applause, applause. I thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the 40, almost 50 people at one time who spent their afternoon with us.
3, 4 hand claps.
Appreciate
this is
it.
great.
Yeah,
5. They're going up to the sky.
I think they're very happy campers. Thank you very much. David, thank you for your help.
Yeah, and don't forget the audience, when we close this out, there'll be a survey that pops up and you'll have another opportunity provide your comments on
And
this.
you two just got a
Great.
heart, just not only thumbs
Oh, I
up,
saw
but a
that
heart.
heart and
A
thumbs
heart.
up.
Like,
This
oh,
is
yeah.
wonderful. Another
Yeah.
heart.
Yeah.
Can we have 3 hearts, 4 hearts?
Yay.
This is great.
It's
Thank
so
you.
great.
This has been
But I think it was a
wonderful.
great team effort, and I appreciate the audience as much as I do.
Well,
the
and
speakers.
I want to say thank you to a few people who I know who are on this list, like Karen Darner, who's one of the, one of the foremothers for all of us who
Oh, yes.
who
Karen,
taught elementary
hello.
school in Arlington and was actually one of my siblings' kids' teacher at one point, and
And
Margot
a colleague in
Horner.
the General Assembly of
Yeah,
mine.
yeah, and Margot Horner, and then not to least of whom my sister-in-law Marty Guthrie.
Was Barb Brown on?
Yep, Barb Brown is on. They're just I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time you all spent with us today. This was really great, and I had a good time.
Thank you all.
Okay. With that,
Thanks to everybody, and enjoy the spring.
we'll
Take your allergy pills.
You got that right.